Hello, this is a paper I am hoping to present at the Oxford Baha'i Studies Seminar on the 20th of December 2020. It's called Cohesion and Leadership in the Babi and Baha'i Religions, Some Sociological Considerations. It is not uncommon for religious and other social movements to fracture over time into competing subgroups, split over differences of belief or leadership, or along ethnic or national lines. Religious movements seem particularly susceptible to such fission, perhaps because religious enthusiasm is less likely to focus on specific practical goals and be more likely to generate competing claims to charismatic authority. But even more secular movements can be subject to sometimes bitter internal splits and rivalries, whether based on different policy objectives, ideological disagreements, or the simple clash of personalities, with both the early socialist and women's suffrage movements providing examples of such divisions. What then holds some movements together whilst others fracture? In some cases, cohesion is created and maintained by coercion, as with the form of Christianity, which became the state religion of the Roman Empire, by which a particular version of religious belief and practice was enforced by the state, with rival versions being declared heretical and subject to persecution. Similarly, after the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, a strict Communist Party orthodoxy was maintained, with dissidents being eliminated or forced into exile. Cohesion based on coercion may become embedded in tradition and thus continue over time, but it is inherently fragile, for when the coercion is removed, the basis for cohesion is lost. In the case of Roman Christianity, when divisions of political power occurred, enforcement was no longer possible, as with the division between the Eastern and Western orthodoxies, which followed the breakup of the Roman Empire and the later breakaway by the Protestant churches from the Roman Catholic Church. What other bases for continuing cohesion are there? I would suggest two sociological mechanisms which can play a major role in creating and sustaining cohesion without requiring coercion: religious motifs and resource mobilization. I will discuss the first of these two in the present paper and the second in a future paper. As a sociological concept, the religious motif originated in the early and now obscure work of Peter Berger, who in turn had borrowed it and adapted it from two Lutheran theologians. For Berger, the concept of motif expressed a religious movement's fundamental religious concerns. These were likely to also find expression in its doctrines, but were not defined by them. Using this device, Berger identified three basic religious concerns that characterize the Judeo-Christian Islamic or Western religious traditions: enthusiastic, gnostic, and prophetic. Enthusiastic religion emphasized the individual believer's lived experience of the sacred. Pentecostalism would be a good modern example. Gnostic religion focused on the preservation of esoteric truths which could be shared amongst those who were worthy, for example in theosophy, whilst prophetic religion sought to proclaim a message, whether in millenarian or legalistic form. Berger thought that these motifs could be expressed in quite complex fashion in an individual religious movement, so that movements might combine more than one motif, and the expression and interaction of these motifs might vary over time. He also accepted that there could be other motifs that he hadn't identified. Motifs were not pigeonholes to which to assign individual religious movements, but rather dynamic tools of analysis. Thus, Berger used the motif framework in his analysis of the Babi and Baha'i movements, essentially describing a complex transition from an originally millenarian gnostic movement to a legalistic one, both millenarianism and legalism here being defined as forms of prophetic religion. I have provided a lengthy critique of Berger's analysis of the Babi and Baha'i movements elsewhere, as well as building up my own account based on recharacterized motifs. Here, I would like merely to emphasize the crucial role played by the motif I have labeled polar. That is, the deep-seated conviction that there must always be an authoritative supreme leader who acts as an intermediary with the sacred in some way. My invented term is derived from the Sufi concept of the master as the qutb, or pole towards which the faithful turn for guidance and spiritual grace. This motif was a crucial part of the Sheikhi movement, out of which Babism first emerged, in the concept of the perfect Shi'i as the fourth support of true faith, and has remained a vital part of Babi and Baha'i thinking ever since. Sociologically, it is linked to an eagerness to follow a succession of those perceived as charismatic leaders. During the Baha'i period, it has contributed powerfully to the relatively smooth series of successions to leadership, from Baha'u'llah to Abdul Baha, then to Shukr Effendi, to the Hands of the Cause acting as custodians, and then to the Universal House of Justice. These smooth transitions should not be taken for granted. They were each a potential crisis, and at every stage there were challenging complications, both in terms of major unexpected events, notably the establishment of the guardianship and the lack of a will written by Shukr Effendi, and rival claimants to leadership. Despite this, the overwhelming majority of Baha'is chose to follow what became an official line of succession, and there was no significant schism, with alternative Baha'i sects, such as the followers of Muhammad Ali, Ibrahim Khalilullah, and Mason Rimi, failing to become securely established. The Babi period is more complex, of course, and whilst many of the early Babis saw the Bab as the successor to the Sheikhi masters, his appeal was much broader, both as a promised messiah and as a holy man, whilst the crises consequent on his confinement in the remote fortresses of Azerbaijan and his later execution threatened the cohesion of the movement. In the first case, through the emergence of what Berger terms a charismatic field, in which several leading disciples were accorded shared messianic status with the Bab, and in the second, with the emergence of separate Babi factions, often centered on rival claimants to charismatic authority. We may note that in both cases the Babis sought fresh charismatic guidance, which indicates the continuing importance of the polar motif. But there clearly was a real danger that the movement would completely fracture and collapse. That it didn't seems to have been due almost entirely to the work of Mirza Hussain Ali, the future Baha'u'llah, who long before he openly made claim to be the Bab's successor, had begun to bring the Babi remnant together and provide them with effective leadership. Again, an expression of the attraction of the polar motif to the Babis. The importance of the polar motif as a factor in cohesion is underlined by a comparison with other major motifs in Babi Baha'i history, most notably with the legalistic, millenarian and social reformist motifs. Although these have played a highly significant, although complexly varying role in the religion's history and the followers' beliefs, they have generally not been a significant factor in ensuring cohesion, save for Baha'u'llah's claim to have fulfilled Babi messianic expectations, which gained him the adherence of those Babis who had not already become his devotees. The salience of the polar motif in Babi Baha'i history is not unique to these religions, of course. We see it also in the Roman Catholic papacy, Shi'ism, particularly in its Ismaili form, many of the Sufi orders, and the line of Dalai Lamas in Tibetan Buddhism. The Catholic case is particularly revealing, the acceptance of papal authority being the defining characteristic of what became and remains the single largest of all the myriad of Christian sects and churches. Significantly, even in times of crisis, as when there were two or more rival popes serving simultaneously, the Catholic desire for a single authoritative leader remained fundamental to the religion. Note the contrast here with the Eastern Orthodox churches, which early on established a framework of a small group of essentially co-equal patriarchs with geographically defined spheres of authority, which proved able to cope with major historical changes in historical circumstances in a relatively flexible manner. 3 final points about motifs. First, Berger believed that religious doctrines were secondary to the underlying motifs they often expressed. The Baha'i doctrine of the covenant, for example, is an important aspect of Baha'i socialization and identity, and has sometimes been used as a control mechanism, but it has expressed the underlying importance of the polar motif, which goes back to the Sheikhi roots of Babism. I would also add that doctrinal differences, as between the various rival Christian churches, which developed out of early and often very bitter Christological controversies, were not in themselves sociologically significant. Thus, the rival Roman Orthodox, Nestorian, and Monophysite churches, all of which have survived in some form to the present day, as well as Arianism. By contrast, the divide between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism was and remains sociologically significant, even though doctrinally the two churches both adhere to the Nicene Creed, with the polar motif, through the acceptance or rejection of the Pope's particular claims to supreme authority, being the important point of difference between them. For Berger, the motif can be an important determinant of the form of organization which develops in a religious movement. Thus, prophetic religions, such as Babism and Baha'ism, are always likely to stress strong organization as a means of presenting and preserving their message, whilst Gnostic religions are likely to be close-knit guardians of their esoteric secrets, and enthusiastic movements may take a variety of organizational forms as long as they fulfill their experiential goals. Pentecostalism is an interesting case in point here, being one of the most successful religious movements of modern times, whilst remaining decentralized and localized in its organizational structure. Finally, Berger thought that the motif would make a difference to the attitude of the religionists to the wider world, with those in prophetic religions necessarily engaging with it in some way, whilst esotericists kept their distance so as to protect their secrets, or perhaps we should add, commonly create a hierarchy of initiates, and those in enthusiastic groups emphasized the importance of individual experience. It must be emphasized that the motif concept does not provide a total explanation for cohesion in the absence of coercion, but I would suggest that it plays an important role, and one that can be useful as a subject of further research. I hope to present a second paper on the role of resource mobilization perspective in cohesion at a future date. If you watched this on YouTube, then thank you for listening. If you like these videos, you're welcome to subscribe to my channel. I'll try to answer any questions you may have about this video in a future one. By the way, those who want to support the development of the channel can do so through Patreon or PayPal. I'll give details below the video. You can also click the like button so that I can get an idea of which videos are of greatest interest to viewers. Have a good day.